So our group is presenting on Nikki Khanna's research on reflected appraisals and the one-drop rule and how it affects racial identities. So in the past, researchers have studied the concept of multiracial and identities and how these identities are measured in the US, particularly in the southern region. So to answer the question, an informal rule known as the one-drop rule came about. And according to this rule, anyone with a drop of Black blood was considered Black. So during the Jim Crow era, the one-drop rule was legalized in order to enforce segregation. If you were a biracial person who could physically pass as white, then you were able to identify as white to resist facing the same discrimination other bicultural individuals faced and indulge in the privileges available to white people. So although these research has been done on one-drop rule, it has mainly focused on the quantitative data as opposed to the qualitative data and doesn't really take into account other factors such as physical appearance and reflected appraisal. So in Khanna's study on the impact of reflected appraisals and the one-drop rule on racial identities, she essentially examines how people identify based on their own perceptions and society's perceptions of their identity, as well as how history may have impacted these attitudes. So in order to examine this, Khanna chooses to view racial identity in two ways. So the first way is her public identity, which is the identity that an individual presents to others, whereas the second way, which is the internalized identity, is the identity that individuals most strongly identify with. So Khanna's first research question is, how do Black white Americans identify and why? So this question is in regards to internalized identity and considers the race or races that they choose to identify with and what factors weigh in on their self-concepts. So then her second research question asks how others view them. So this is in regards to their public identity. The public identity, as we mentioned before, is shaped by their perception of how others may view them in terms of their physical appearance and their symbolic interactions with their environment. So then the question is based around the concept of reflected appraisals and the symbolic interactionist theory, which states that people basically interpret meaning and develop views about their environment and communicate with each other based on symbols, which are both verbal and nonverbal. So then Khanna also questions whether the one-drop rule trumps physical appearance and how it may influence how other perceives a biracial individual's appearance. And then the last question Khanna asks is whether Black-white individuals are limited by the one-drop rule today to identify exclusively as Black.
So when it comes to some of the methods she used to conduct this interview, by the way, started way back in 2005. The interviews between 40 individuals that had to be biracial. They were required to have one Black and one white parent. And people that she interviewed were, of course, college educated, because that's where she reached out to people. And there was this snowball effect of gathering an audience for this type of study. She got the people. She, had measurements of who they were and their class and stuff like that. And then she started to look at the parents of those individuals. For example, over 70% of those respondents had a white mother and then a Black father. And then reversely, they had over 20% that were sons or daughters of Black mothers and then white fathers. And so when she took all this information, she started conducting these interviews about how they felt about themselves and then how they feel in terms of social interactions with other people and the types of challenges that they face because of their race or because of how they communicate their race to other people. And it was a group of 18 to 45 in terms of age. And so she gathered adults primarily because if she gathered children or people below the age of 18, they wouldn't have the same experiences as an adult. And then if she got someone that was older than 45, they might have lived through the civil rights era. And so that would have had something to do with the results that she got from this search. So she primarily focused on post-civil rights era respondents. And then from there, she gathered info on their fluidity of how they feel about themselves, the fluidity of how they respond to their own identity to other people. And yeah.
Okay, so for the results, the article resulted in the physical appearance rule mattering way more than the one drop rule, just because a lot of people are judged and were judged back then, and it continuously happens. They're judged based on their physical appearance. Black white Southerners were more than likely to identify themselves as Black instead of white, and Black men had more wives who were white than white wives having Black husbands. Internalized racial identities resulted in having more variation. It was a lot more open. 82.5% actually labeled themselves as multiracial when she conducted the research. And throughout the research, there were a few people who were categorizing themselves as monoracial just because of the way others saw them rather than how they thought of themselves, or because of the influence that others had on them. And though a lot of people in the research resulted in calling themselves multiracial, they actually ended up identifying themselves more with one than the other, or they would identify more with their internalized identity. And many of the individuals that the research was conducted on actually were strongly identifying with Black just because of the way other people viewed them due to the skin color or the color that their parents were, or because of how they acted. And one of the girls who was interviewed actually said that because of the way people look at her and because of what they thought of her, she identified more with Black than with white, only because she mentioned that if she were to go to a job interview, they probably would either not believe that she was white or they wouldn't look at her and think right away, oh, she's white. So that is her reasoning for identifying more with Black than with white. And this also happens a lot nowadays just because a lot of people tend to side more with one than the other due to what constantly happens when it comes to race and one's identity.
I will be talking about the limitations and the group discussion. First, we had many limitations in the article, or Kana discussed many limitations within the article. One of them was that the sample size was limited to those in the South of the United States, meaning that the experience of being a Black, white, or multiracial individual is not representative of all those who identify as such. Secondly, the sample size was also very small, as Pedro mentioned earlier, was only 40 respondents, which also means that the small representation was not representative of the experience as well. The next limitation was the lack of social class. All of the respondents were either current college students or college graduates, and it was mentioned in the article that if social class plays a role in how one identifies themselves, that means that the one drop rule would and is still probably prevalent amongst biracial Black, white Southerners who are less educated and lower class, meaning that identification is not represented thoroughly also. Finally, there was an imbalance in ways that public and internalized racial identities were observed. The open-ended questions allowed for racial identity to be observed fluidly as either Black, white, or multiracial. However, closed-ended questions only allow the respondent to choose between black or white, while leaving out multiracial or biracial as an option, which is something crucial that should have been included, as we do have those who identify as multiracial. By not having that specific option, this leaves out people who do not identify as solely black or solely white and cannot be used to examine how and whether reflected appraisal and the one-drop rule shapes identities. Next, we will go into our group discussion, which I will also talk about. We definitely enjoyed the approach towards the topic and research done towards it. We also like that Kana used a variety of ways to receive information. Though the closed-ended questions were a limitation, using both closed and open-ended questions, they were able to get a variety of answers that were also in depth. We also do, however, agree how Kana said that the limitations in the sample size could be more widely expanded, because right now it only focused on Southerners in the United States, and we can and should assume, however, that the one-drop rule applies to identity and affects others throughout the world and not just Southerners in the United States. We should also take account how identity and the one-drop rule affects people all out throughout the world. And yeah, that is our presentation. Thank you for watching, guys. We appreciate it a lot. Yeah.